When it comes to Pokemon, I've talked about in-game tiers, I've talked about plenty of different design choices, I've talked about plenty of different subjects, from move sets to shininess, whatever have you. Over the years, I've talked about a lot of it. But one of the things I've never really talked about, which is kind of the focal point of why I play Pokemon games, is team building and what Pokemon bring to the table. Uh, which is kind of why I'm here to really play into a tier list and why Kanto is actually pretty special in some regards, while also not being a great thing. I will be doing this for later generations, and we'll kind of see an example of failure generations pretty quickly while having some good ones. But we're here to specifically talk about Generation 1 games because I think it's, while Fire Red and Leaf Green technically count, some of these Pokemon have been changed to be not as good or super limiting, which would actually change this. And I'll probably do one for Fire Red and Leaf Green. But we have plenty to go to, so let's talk about the starters originally. We are going to end up just leaving most of these out because you do get these at stage 1. But you have, of course, the grass poison type, which is pretty prominent. You can scroll down and find Oddish, which is very similar to Venusaur, or you could go Victory Bell, which is also very similar. They do similar things, except this one's a starter. It does evolve pretty early in comparison, 4 levels earlier. And when it comes down to it, it's actually a very interesting Pokemon, not because it doesn't have copies like we'll talk about with plenty of these, but because of really, it's the best of both worlds. It does have the attack score that can go off of both of these if need be. It doesn't have the move pool, but it does have access to, say, Leech Seed, which is really good, and Razor Leaf, which is insta crit in Generation 1, meaning that it is a pretty strong contender, which goes into Charmander as well, being that it gets Slash insta crit. It does get access to Dig, which is not wholly unique in Generation 1. But it does get access to Flamethrower by level up, which is cool, and it does eventually become a Fire Flying type, which would only be shared by all the way at the bottom with Moltres, which is interesting for team building wise. It does kind of suck for Flying type in general, which is why as a team building it's not super special. But then we have Squirtle, which is replaceable pure water type. I don't really need to go into it. I should hope not. But yeah, it's very replaceable. That's not to say it isn't the best starter or anything, but when it comes to team building wise, I find myself very unlikely to choose Squirtle over the other two because of the niche that they fill versus the abundance of water types. Uh, so it kind of gets to be a little bit of a neuter situation. It's also kind of the same problem in yellow, though I won't really get into a lot of the yellow stuff. It's mostly red and blue. Uh, but Bulbasaur comes in at a time where it's usable. Charmander kind of gets screwed over. It would probably go down technically, but then again, there's no good fire type anyway. And Squirtle is actually probably even lower because it comes at the worst time possible, and you get access to so many different water types really, really quickly. But that goes into the bugs, which the bugs themselves, funnily enough, I would kind of say Caterpie isn't amazing in Fire Red and Leaf Green, for instance, but we're talking about Red and Blue, which is just kind of replaceable. It's, funnily enough, supposed to be like a pseudo-psychic type. It doesn't have the typing for Stab, which is why it doesn't do great, and it does have Powders, which is interesting, but the problem is Butterfree isn't that great. It doesn't really have a great team building. There is something to be said about Metapod getting one early and then saying it's not usable, but I'm just going to go with the first stages for this. Probably should have just grabbed the first stage evolution list, but I think all of them were like most of the series. But this is where we're going to differ because this is why I chose Red and Blue, because I think Beedrill is actually very interesting. If you don't know, Poison itself is a very different type in Generation 1. Not only is it awful because it's weak to Psychic and it has access to Sludge as its best attacking move, but it's also weak to Bug, which brings up a very niche and interesting thing that Beedrill hits like a truck on Erica, which is hilarious to me. Plus, it actually does decently against Agatha of all things. It isn't gonna win any major awards, but it still has a use all the way to the end of the game. which, funnily enough, being the only bug type in the game that actually has interesting like matchups. Pinsir doesn't have stab, same with Scyther, and the other bug types that do appear, which I mean, Butterfree doesn't even get one. I'm pretty sure we're out of bug types. There's not that many, but oh, Parasect. Parasect technically could, but are you really using Parasect? But yeah, overall, I do think Beedrill's kind of interesting, which goes into Pidgey. I think it's perfectly mid. We'll talk about the other better flying types in a bit. Rattata is also kind of mid for building a team. It's a normal type, which you can look and find so many better normal types in Generation 1. Clefairy, name one. Jigglypuff if you're building a team. I'd even argue Chansey is much more usable. I kind of fucked that up, but Ditto is not, but we'll talk about that. It's overall a pretty mid option. I do think it's kind of interesting. It evolves pretty quickly and it's fast, and it will actually help you against Misty, but for a team building exercise, I don't think it's inherently special. It's probably definitely worse than the bugs, and I do think it's actually worse than Pidgey, which is really sad because while I think Raticate is the better Pokemon for in-game, and I have no idea, but I do think that Pidgey just has a little bit more interesting team building, which goes in Spearow, which I think is very replaceable. Don't get me wrong, its early access is probably what's going to put it up here, being that the flying normal type is actually not that prominent in Generation 1. It gets a little insane later, but when you get down to it, you are rocking flying types that just don't really succeed in anything. You can get access to Zubat, but its best move is Wing Attack. Okay. And then, I mean, Butterfree gets... I don't think it even gets Gust in Red and Blue. I rarely use it. Farfetch, which, good one. Doduo, which goes in Dodrio, which is the one we'll talk about eventually. But your flying types are very limited. I mean, Aerodactyl's at right around the 7th gym usually. The legendaries are either slightly earlier or slightly later, depending on how you go about it. Gyarados doesn't have a flying move. Like, overall, flying type moves are pretty limited. This is a bug. But overall, when it comes down to it, Spearow is replaceable merely because of Doduo. But it does have an interesting application, being that it's not as replaceable as you would think, which is why I'll actually put it here. It's a little bit of a concession, but it's definitely bottom of the barrel for interesting, which goes in Ekans. It's just kind of mid. I would love to say that because it's early, it's actually interesting, and I do think it's top of mid on this, but when it comes to poison typing, it's kind of flooded. That's also to say poison typing isn't interesting at all. It does get access to Glare, which is something, and like Dig and so on and so forth, but who cares? Like, that's kind of what Ekans' problem is. Like, you're gonna go with another poison type. It's very, like, there's so many better poison types. That's the problem. Even Venusaur. Like, so just overall, not a great pickup when it comes to team building. Pikachu, I actually think this is a interesting one. I do think it's probably up here. It's probably the most interesting one, because if you look at the electric types when they appear very late in the game. For instance, you're locked in Power Plant. Where's Magnemite? Why am I looking here? Well, Jolteon is locked in Celadon, but you're also limiting yourself because you lost 2 of these, which one of these you shouldn't pick anyway. But yeah, as you get along with... There's Magnemite. Sorry, it took me so long. For some reason, I think Magnemite's always after Marowak. I don't know why. But when you look at the electric type offerings, there's not that many, especially in Generation 1. Your offerings are all locked into the Power Plant or Celadon, so the early electric type is legit Pikachu. And you have Magnemite, which is pure electric in this gen, so it's not even that unique. Voltorb, which you have to give the TM for, which at that point it's already past anything that is relevant, really. Get another electric type. Jolteon, which you're dropping 2 others, which we'll talk about. And yeah, Zapdos, which is a legendary. So overall, it's just not a very standout type in Generation 1. It's good, don't get me wrong. It's probably one of the standards people pick up, but it's not overall interesting to kind of build around for the most part. And that's why Pikachu stands out, because it is interesting. Yes, in Red and Blue, it doesn't get access to Thunderbolt by level up, but it gets access to Thunder, which allows you to not necessarily spend Thunderbolt on it if you can avoid it. especially since it evolves in Raichu right around Celadon, which is when you would be getting Jolteon anyway, so it gets a power boost and feels a lot better. But Sandshrew is very replaceable. It's a ground type that doesn't get a lot of ground type action. It does get Slash, but it is very slow. There's that. Nidoran female into Nidoran male, we'll talk about here. They're both kind of in the same group. The Moonstone thing. The Moonstone means this is one of the best Pokemon you could pick up, which is kind of true, but I find myself in a very weird spot. They're not replaceable, but they are interesting. Probably up here. I won't say they're super special because there's a lot of Pokemon that just barely don't make that. And the reason they're interesting is because they fill an eventual ground typing, plus an early evolution. You have Body Slam for Nidoqueen, means you don't need to spend the TM on it. And you can give so many different TMs to both of them that they kind of fill a niche like Swiss Army knife slot in your team building, which is interesting, especially since they appear early enough. In Pokemon Yellow, which isn't really the conversation here, but I do want to bring it up that Double Kick is prominent here. And it can actually save you from being locked into just Pikachu or end up using like a Caterpie to kind of make your way through it. Overall, I do think these are very interesting. I don't really like them that much because they are poison typing, which is covered by half the damn decks at this point. But they definitely do bring something interesting to the table with their TM compatibility, which is also where Clefairy is going to shine. And actually, my argument is that it's super special. Now, normal typings are not unique. In fact, you could go and find thousands of normal type, not thousands, but almost a dozen normal typings that are really inherently strong, that do so many different things, but a lot of them are locked to the late game, like an incredible amount. This is also in the generation where Body Slam is available pretty early. Before you can actually skip the second gym to go and get it if you want, but it's more about TM compatibility and also normal typing not being a very interesting type at a certain point. When it comes to normal typings, they're really good. It's probably the best type, arguably, in Generation 1 competitive, but in-game, it's not taken over by too many strong Pokemon. Yes, there's such thing as Persian, but Slash is incredibly late. You have Wigglytuff, which is just a worse Clefable, and you go on and on. I've already talked about Chansey as a special wall, but it's in the Safari Zone. You also have the same with Tauros, Kangaskhan. They're locked in a spot where they're not that interesting because they're so late. And we're talking about different dual typings. I don't really see these as normal typings. Yes, they do have the stab, but when it comes to that kind of versatile role, Clefairy is the only one that I think is inherently interesting. It's especially nice because Clefairy's move pool without TMs is bad, which is why it would probably be interesting on more normal things. But Mega Punch is available in Mount Moon, which not a lot of Pokemon are going to want at that point. Maybe if you're still carrying around Pikachu or so on. But you have usable moves even at the bottom of the barrel. And that's what makes Clefairy and into Clefable incredibly, incredibly powerful. Just one of those things that need to be pointed out. Now, we have the oddity. It's always weird when you look at the listing and you see Vulpix this early. But you have Vulpix, which is just replaceable. All the fire types, I'm going to let you know, are very replaceable. I think I would argue they're better than Sandshrew in this regard, whereas Sandshrew is replaced by so many different ground types that you can find. It's also one of those things that Vulpix is replaceable by just move pool problems. And it actually has one of the better fire type move pools, but it just go with Charmander. I'd even argue that some of the other fire types like Magmar, if possible, version exclusive stuff, but is definitely a much better regard than just the pure firing type of Ninetales. Ninetales is good, but it happens to be that fire typing itself is really shit to build around in Generation 1. Which goes into Jigglypuff. I talked about it with my Clefairy thing, but there is something relevant to be talking about when it comes to Jigglypuff. I do think is replaceable to an insane degree, but it is a early enough wall with access to really good moves by level up, which is different than Clefairy, that I do think it has a special spot when it comes to team building. I do think it's kind of like the health sponge, which is actually not that prominent. Yes, there are health sponge in the game. There's plenty of them, but they all fit like a very tank oriented role with the health bonus kind of just being the bonus, whereas this is solely around HP. So if you're doing like a stat focus thing, it's actually kind of interesting. Just saying. It's not it's not chancy, but it's definitely, you know, up there. Which goes into Zubat. I'm gonna be brutally honest. Zubat is super mid. As a flying type, it's outclassed by everything. And as a poison type, it's outclassed by everything, which is really depressing because it's definitely just not great. I do want to say that I would probably be more interested in using Ekans normally, and probably even Pidgey and Rattata. I do think it is usable as somebody who's gone through the entire game with almost every Pokemon solo. It has some usability as a Zubat and as a Golbat, but it is definitely neutered heavily. Which goes into Oddish. I do think Vileplume kind of gets stuck in being not good because of its stats, but I do think is just inherently, like, I want to say it's almost interesting but replaceable. And it's kind of punishing for me to say this because you do get it early enough that it's not as bad of a choice. So in reality, I probably should move it up, but we'll leave it there and we'll see how my mind changes. Paris, it's interesting, but it's also replaceable. As a bug type, I think you just go Weedle, but as a grass type, it doesn't get anything. Like, what are you doing? Mega Drain? Go with one of the other ones that actually get moves. Razor. But that's also why Oddish is here. It doesn't really get a good move pool. Yes, it gets Petal Dance eventually, which, cool. But it's overall very slow. It doesn't get a lot of moves in general. It does get Powders, which is cool, but yeah. It's just Bulbasaur is better. Paris, I think, is at the bottom here. I do think it is interesting to a certain degree, but it definitely is just Spore. That's literally it. It doesn't have a great tanking quality. Its typing isn't interesting. Its move pool is shit. So at the end of the day, it's not a fantastic option. Which goes into Venonat, which would be a very cool Pokemon to use if it was available early. But hey, good on you for being super mid. And as somebody who used the solo, it's also one of the hardest Pokemon to get through. My god, Venonat is bad. I kind of want to put it, I just think it doesn't appear at a time where it's usable. Diglett, a lot of people will love to say that this is one of the best options in the game. I happen to think for a ground type, yes, it appears at the perfect time to get as much use as possible out of a ground type, but it's inherently weak and its availability is not super unique. If we look at the ground types, I already talked about Nidoking a bit, but if you look deeper, even Graveler, which we're not going to talk about Golem, but Graveler's interesting. You have Marowak, which I get why a lot of people don't go with it. It's kind of the same Sandshrew problem, but I think Marowak has a lot better offerings, specifically because Fire Blast exists. Also, at the same time, when it comes to ground typings, like, there's Rhyhorn into Rhydon, which I think has a much more relevancy, even though it is really late. It's just, when it comes to specifically building a team, I feel like Diglett kind of just handicaps you, which kind of goes into replaceable. It is one of the better replaceable mons. Yes, ground typing isn't that varied, so it does have that niche no matter what, and it is super fast, which slash insta crit. It gets access to dig by level up, which is insane. 100 power in this generation is dig. Overall, it's an incredible mon. I just think for building a team, it's not inherently that special. But moving on, we have access to Meowth, which I've already talked about. Slash is very limiting. It does get Bite, but you're going to be relying on some really weird TMs. But for normal typing, surprisingly, it's actually kind of fun. I do think it's really replaceable. In fact, I would probably pick Jigglypuff over it. But I do think it's probably right here. It is good, though. It is good to use on a team. Psyduck, you get this really... It depends on when you start fishing and stuff, but for a water type, this is actually just mid. Like, yeah, it has the interesting, like, psychic type move, but it's going to be using Surf like a water type. It's going to be using weird moves like Disable if you're only using level up moves. It doesn't get access to a inherent amount of special moves, though there's a setup move that's kind of interesting with it. But I'd probably just play at the bottom. This is where a lot of the water types are going to go that appear in this portion of mid to late game. But we'll see that. Mankey, which appears relatively early, and when it comes to fighting type, is actually super super special. And I think I would argue that it's one of the more interesting Pokemon. When you look at the fighting types in Generation One, they're all pretty shit. There's a couple that have like some really interesting qualities, specifically Poliwrath, but that's more to do with just its general move pool than its fighting type. Yes, sometimes you can put submission on it and it's cool, but for the most part, you're just doing it because it's the stats, move pool, and what it can learn. But you do have Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But overall, when it comes to fighting types, you don't have a lot of options. So I happen to actually think that it you could argue that it's very super special, especially since it is a fast fighting type, which if you look at the fighting types offered here, it's definitely really, really interesting. Uh, and that's kind of where I'm going to put it. It's probably the bottom of super special by a long shot for me. But when it comes to building the team itself, if I think of Mankey and Primeape, I think of there's nothing really going to replace that. Yes, it does have better offerings in Fire Red and Leaf Green, and even in later generations, I think it's much better to team build with. But that doesn't mean it's not a good team builder here. It's very unique in when it appears, it gets access to Instacrit Karate Chop, even though Karate Chop is not fighting, sucks. But it just does a lot of damage and hits really fast, which is something that isn't super apparent in the early game, even though it's one of the few, along with Pikachu, that hits really fast. And I guess you could argue Charmander and Zubat, but whatever. I just happen to think it's very special for what it does, which goes into Growlithe. I've already talked about Vulpix and limitations. I actually think Growlithe is in the same boat, but you can do a little more on the physical side, and that's about it. Like, it's just, do you want physical? Do you want special dominance? That's all you're getting out of a fire type in this generation, and it doesn't do much more. Where were we? Poliwag. Now, this is going to be a lot of people's, like, niche thing, because one, you're going to end up picking a Poliwhirl to get to Jinx, which we'll talk about. And Poliwag, you kind of are limited by your what path you ended up choosing to pick it up. I happen to think Poliwag itself and to Poliwrath is very interesting because of its move pool. So, of course, there's Hypnosis and a Body Slam, Submission, Ice Beam, Surf, and a few other things that I'm not going to really get into. But it's inherently a very interesting water type. It's also not that as accessible, which is where the problem lies on this Pokemon. It's also a water type, which is not that interesting, but is a fighting type, so it's a little special. It's one of those things where it's weird. That's all Poliwag will ever be to me, is like a really weird water type that I really wish I could put up there, but it gets covered by other water types, and its fighting typing isn't what's special about it at all, so that typing doesn't make it super good. And it's really just the move pool in a very dry desert of move pools that is Gen 1. So, yeah, when it comes down to that, I really wish I could move it up, but it just happens to be everything works against it. Which goes into Abra. Abra is actually super unique. We're also just going to say right now it's not usable. We're talking without trades, without, collecting stuff. So you have to sacrifice other starters if you're picking Squirtle. So that's what I'm talking about here. We have Abra, which actually with Kadabra is relatively interesting. Very fast psychic type attacker. It's the I think it's always going to be here, but the problem is there's a lot of psychic types, which kind of brings it down to here, especially since you can't fully evolve it in this case. So it is a limiting function, but I'm going to be brutally honest. Even if I allowed trades here, it would probably go here. It doesn't go that far up. It doesn't learn anything special. It doesn't get like an elemental punch because of Alakazam. It doesn't overall get that much out of it. Yes, it can hit harder, but we'll have other psychic types we'll talk about. Machop is kind of in the same case here. Machoke is interesting for being a fighting type in a game where it's bad, but this is where it kind of is always going to be. I happen to think it just kind of fits here. It's almost in mid. In fact, if people were to play in mid, I wouldn't be mad. But if Machamp was allowed, which real quick, it would probably be like a little bit more interesting because of access to Fire Blast and a few other things that it does have as a Machoke, but it can actually hit a little bit harder. Which goes into Bellsprout, which is actually the more interesting of the grass, and merely because it has a different type of use. Whereas Oddish and Bulbasaur kind of cover the same ground, and it just happens to be that Oddish doesn't have an amazing move pool to kind of be usable. Bulbasaur is a powdered focused kind of status abuser, even if level 55 or sleep powder is ridiculous. Bellsprout's a attacker. It doesn't get access to a great poison move. In fact, it doesn't get one. But it gets access to Body Slam, Swords Dance, which is a great combo. Gets access to Razor Leaf, which, cool. But overall, it's just a very usable grass type in the grass type held as Gen 1 and so on. Tentacool. Now, this is interesting because it's not a great move pool, but when you get access to this, you should be right around Surf, which means it's usable. It's also a poison typing, so welcome to hell, Tentacool. Yes, is high special. It's a high tank in that regard, but it is a water type, which isn't that interesting. Especially a poison typing, which isn't that interesting because it legit can't use its poison typing that well. So why is it poison typing? But next we have Geodude into Graveler, which again Golem will not be talked about here. But when you get access to Geodude pretty early, and you get access to a lot of moves that make Graveler very dangerous. Rock Slide is found on top of the department store if you need it by TM, and Earthquake is of course found pretty late, but it also has an amazing level of move pool, which just works for what it's trying to do. In fact, when it comes to ground types, it's the only one that you would pick up for its attack stat, which is weird to say because you look at it and you talk to people and it's like, well, there's Rhydon, which is a better option, but it also comes very late, and by that point most of your Pokemon are in that kind of attack score. Onyx is bad, we've all know this, and Dugtrio, while it does hit hard for when you get it, it's mostly speed and it doesn't hit inherently hard, which is why Graveler is actually pretty special. It's not overall super interesting, but I do think it's above Jigglypuff in this regard. Excuse me. Ponyta. In the world of fire types, you'd think it would actually be the worst one. And it appears too late to really get much use. It's in the fire type hell. We've already talked about this. Just pick your fire type. If you don't pick a fire type, who cares? Slowpoke. Now, when it comes to Slowpoke, it's slow, but it's a water psychic type, which we'll talk about a bunch of those. It happens to be, for in-game purposes, not a very fun one to team build around. Slowbro itself is not inherently super strong without setup, and while it does have a decent move pool, and by decent I mean water type move pool, and it does get access to Psychic, it doesn't, besides a great matchup against bosses, inherently when you're building a team around just covering so much stuff, yeah, you're covering that, but you're also using a Psychic and a water type slot. And yes, you could double up, that's not the argument in here, but for what it comes down to limiting, it's very interesting, but it's also just very flooded. Ignoring the pun there, it's very flooded in so many different multiple typings here. Next we go to Magnemite, which I kind of talked about, comes a little too late to be interesting, and is just kind of replaceable. I do think being electric type, and Magneton especially being pretty strong in a lot of the stat departments, kind of brings it up here, but it is kind of just replaceable, which really sucks because it is a really cool Pokemon. Farfetch'd, I do think has Swords Dance opportunities, making it a little bit interesting, but it's kind of just super replaceable. It happens to be one of the interesting trades that you can have access to first, but it also appears at the worst time possible, right before Surge. And while Erica is a decent matchup for it, a lot of this game doesn't really have a lot of good options for normal flying types that don't hit as hard as possible. We'll talk about the Dodrio problem as we get to it, but Farfetch'd is kind of just in the replaceable department. It is way better than Pidgey in this regard. I would probably argue it's probably better than the fire types, but not reaching into this. I kind of wish I made another tier now that I look at it, but ignoring that, where am I at? We're at Doduo. Speaking of that, Doduo is actually very interesting because One, it's always going to be here as the strongest flying normal type, but it's also appearing late enough where it's not going to get as much use as possible. And that's not to say Dodrio is inherently powerful. Yes, it's stronger than Firo, but it's just overall in the same problem camp of flying types not being inherently good against a lot of the late game options. You have what? Sabrina, if you're faster, like, and that's kind of late game, not really. I mean, it's after Silphco, but what are you doing? Are you sitting above the ground types that Giovanni uses? Like, overall, flying normal is just not that, like, usable in this game. So when it comes down to it, it's really just weird to team build with them. You'll usually want a flying type, which is why I could argue either of these kind of across. But whereas Firo kind of covers the early game and you can understand why it would be there for that long, Doduo appears right before Erica if you go out of your way, and it's not inherently that usable, which is when you get Fly, which kind of defeats the purpose of Drill Peck sometimes. So it's... Tri-Attack is cool and all, but it doesn't appear early enough for it to matter. Which really sucks. I feel like Doduo that appears like north of Cerulean would be an interesting spot. But we go into Steel. This is super fucking uninteresting. I think this might be one of the worst Pokemon. Yes, it's technically not bad. In fact, it's probably the best of all of these as a Pokemon, but I'd rather just figure out how to use these three than use Dugong. Dugong is super uninteresting. Which goes into Grimer. Actually kind of a weird Pokemon. As a poison typing, it's about as useful as Ekans. It doesn't have a great option. But it does actually get to use poison type attacks for a decent amount beside Acid. And while it does get decent TM compatibility, it's just ultimately replaceable. Definitely bottom happens to be the poison type problem, which goes into Shelter. Actually kind of an interesting Pokemon here with Clamp. Clamp with the ice type evolution, sorry. So it becomes water ice. I don't know what I was trying to say here. Which you can kind of get pretty early depending on how you go with your fishing order. I've already talked about this. I have to say it's the same thing as like Slowbro, except a little better in like team building. I'd probably put it here, but again, water types and as we'll talk about it, ice types are plentiful, especially since Ice Beam is so easy to put on other Pokemon. Ghastly, this happens to be the only ghost. Straight up happens to be the only ghost, which is just special by itself. It really sucks because Gengar is one of my favorite Pokemon. I think it's pretty obvious. But when it comes to building a team, this is where a lot of the poison typing is going to come up. Because there's a couple really good poison types, and I think there's one more we'll talk about. Or did... I thought there was, but it's not coughing. I really thought I miscounted at one point. Okay, never mind. There is no more poison typing, but you have to contest the poison typing if you're trying not to double up, which I usually try and avoid a lot of the time. But you have to contest with so many different poison types here. The Nidos, you have Bulbasaur, Oddish, you have the other garbage poison types. Like, there's a lot of poison types, not to mention, like, Weedle, for instance. And so you're stuck choosing, if you're choosing one specifically, team building wise, yes, it's the only ghost, but this is kind of the excuse I have for a lot of people. Because it's the only ghost, I usually ignore the fact it's a poison typing, especially since it's not used as a poison type ever. It's never been. So when it comes down to it, it is usually just noticed as a ghost, which is why it's up here. I happen to think it's actually probably here. It doesn't have the usability of Clefairy that fits on almost every team, but as a special attacker, it's kind of unique with fast special attacking. Being that Haunter is more than likely what we're going to be talking about here. It does have some limitations because the move pools actually do change slightly, but you're going to get access to 1 to 2 TMs, which is also another problem and why, as I think about this for a little bit longer, I'm actually going to put it down here. Yes, the only ghost, and yes, it can kind of succeed with just 1 TM, but it needs at least 1 TM. Which is why it's going to be here. I mean, you could even go with just Mega Drain if you want, but overall you need 1. You need something for it to actually get off the ground. Now that I think of it, I could probably just play that interesting. It would probably be fine. Onyx is super bad. If I put it's always going to be below Graveler no matter what, and in fact, it's probably the most replaceable Pokemon in existence. Rhyhorn and Geodude. Go catch one. It doesn't learn anything special. It doesn't do anything. It's fast, cool. Who cares? Drowsy. Now, this is where a lot of people are going to be super different. I think this is actually a very interesting Pokemon, and it's actually arguable whether it's in super special. And this is one of those things that if you look at all the psychic type offerings, right? You look at Starmie, you look at Mr. Mime, you look at Jinx. Jinx is a little different, but we'll get to that. If you look at the psychic type offerings that are available, it fits this unique thing where it's kind of just a bulky attacker on both sides, which is interesting. It's one of the few mixed attackers that are possible in this game. A lot of them do it, yes, because the move pools are bad. But it's funny that the two mixed attackers that I was going to equate to each other, but for being a mixed attacker, it does the best in both worlds. It hits hard with Psychic because Special is one stat. It has access to Hypnosis, which is really good. It can do Seismic Toss, just like Alakazam or Kadabra in this case. And one, it's not limited by a lot of other factors. Its attack score is decent to even above average in this generation, meaning it can use Headbutt to a decent degree. Has access to plenty of other offerings that I think bring it to a super special. I don't think it's inherently as special as being the only ghost or being the one usable fighting type for as early as it appears, but it definitely does bring a lot of super specialness to the psychic typing when it comes to team building. Krabby, surprisingly not the worst water type. When it comes to water types, if it's a special attacking water type, it's very replaceable. But Krabby is actually a lot better than that. It is a physical type attacker. Crab Hammer is also very interesting. And above all, you can kind of go a little above what you think with Krabby. Voltorb is the electric fast attacker, but it has a big problem. It doesn't hit that hard. Yes, it's interesting to have a fast attacker, but if you look at what we have as offerings real quick, I'm going to put it down here. Fast, 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 technically fast, fast. You can see that fast Pokemon are not a rarity. So it's not a unique stat to really have. Yes, it's the fastest in the game. Go you. But as we'll talk about with Jolteon, it technically is not as good. So I'd probably argue to put below the fire types. I do think it's very replaceable, but it does have a use. Also, the high crit. Didn't mention this, but when it comes to your speed stat and getting a lot of crits easily, it kind of makes me want to put it higher, but I'll just leave it there. Execute. Now, this is where it becomes very interesting. Yes, you're quad weak to bug, but this is a Pokemon that I think if you have every tool available, is one of the more interesting ones. Yes, it's a grass type in very late game, but its usability brings a lot of different teams that you can kind of push forward. It's a great psychic type attacker, we know this, and it does have access to Mega Drain, which is cool, but it also can get Leech Seed, which is just kind of interesting. And that's where I'm going to kind of put it is, I kind of want to put it here, but it kind of appears too late. So we'll put it right here. It's better than Slowpoke and Shelter in this case, but not as good as the Flying Normals. Cubone, I talked about the issue with like Dugtrio not being a good attacker. This is also kind of a similar problem, but it does fix the Sandshrew issue. So it's actually one of the few solo ground types here that can actually get a lot of use. Access to Fire Blast is also pretty cool. You can get Rock Slide as well, so cool. But hopefully you save Body Slam. Hitmonlee, which is... This is where it's going to get really stupid, because you never want to use this Pokemon. But it's the only one with a fighting type move that is not going to hurt itself that's good. Like, 80 power, 80 accuracy, recoil submission is bad. But this has high jump kick. And that's the only reason it's probably going to go up here. It's interesting because of that. I'll put it right here. It really sucks that I have to put it this high, but yeah. Which goes into the amazing Punching Man. I want to point out that Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan have terrible special in this generation, which is why they're so bad. This is mid. This is easily replaceable. Go get a different fighting type. Just don't. You're hurting yourself picking it up. Lickitung, you're again hurting yourself by picking it up, but I do think it's the normal type thing where it's just replaceable. Probably worse than Onyx in this case. I think Onyx is really bad. Never mind. All right, where was I at? Coughing. We are almost done, actually. But we have coughing. I've talked about other poison types. It's the same problem. I do think this has a better option than Grimer, being that it has a little more special to kind of use. And its physical defense is interesting, but it's kind of the same problem as Grimer, and I'm only going to put it above a few slots. It does appear really late, is also a problem. Funnily enough, actually, I think Grimer appears earlier because of Celadon Super Rod. I'm going to put this lower than Grimer. Sorry, totally forgot about that. Next we go into Rhyhorn. This becomes a thing because Golem doesn't exist. This is technically your best offering for a ground rock type, or yeah, in this case, ground rock type. I was gonna flip it, even though it's the only one with this, like, whatever. But Rhydon takes forever to evolve. It appears really late, which is kind of why it's gonna be locked in interesting. You'll notice that the latest Pokemon, like the really late Pokemon, appear not that far. It's just one of those things where you're limited to kind of using something that you can pick up early because you have to go through the rest of the game. And when it comes down to it, it has an amazing move pool, but it's always going to be locked behind the lateness. And level 42 to fully evolve is also kind of a problem. I should have just picked up Solo Evolution. Chansey is inherently fun to use in a solo sense, or even just on your team as a special wall, but because special is one stat, there's so many different special walls, it doesn't really fulfill that niche that well. As a normal type, yes, it's interesting to have a massive special attacking physical type, or physical type, normal type in this case, but normal is inherently a physical typing, so you want to be able to have that. And if you're covering that, then Body Slam goes to something that isn't getting its stab. So it's interesting, but also appears very late, which means it's super replaceable. And in fact, I'd probably argue it's like right here. It's still fun, but inherently it's just not super great. Which goes into Tangela, which is the only grass type that is going to get the mid tier. Its move pool just sucks. That's the big problem here. Yes, growth is available, but why? Just why? It does it, which is funny. You think it would be more special because it's the only grass type that's pure. Whatever, nobody cares. Kangaskhan, I do happen to think is a lot better than Chansey, but as we'll talk about it, it's mostly just due to it being a mixed attacker that does well. I kind of want to put it higher for that, and I'll say it's probably one of the better Safari Mons, but it's kind of just barely below the fire types in this case. It does well at a bunch of different things, but it comes too late to really be the Swiss Army knife that Clefairy already brought to the table. Which goes into Horsey. Again, water type. Where's our water type collection? Oh yeah, it's right here. Technically you can catch this pretty early. I think it has to go before that though. Goldeen, it gets waterfall. And then we go into Starry, which goes into Starmie. You can get this actually quite early as well. And it just happens to be that as a psychic typing, it fulfills a very interesting niche, but it's also very replaceable, which is why it's only going to go like right here. Yes, it has amazing special, has an amazing move pool, but as we'll talk about it, psychic typing is already covered by so many different things, and at the same time, water typing is already covered, and the fast special attacker is already covered by so many different Pokemon that are available. So yeah, when it comes down to it, it probably could be interesting. Actually, I'm gonna put it here with Slowbro. Probably better. Probably better than these. I changed my mind. If these two can go here for what they do, I think this one can for just moveset paralysis, being the only one to do that. But as we get farther along here, we are now at Mr. Mime. This Pokemon is just interesting as fuck. This is a very different ideology here because it's a trade accessible Pokemon. It's in the same problem as we'll talk about with Jinx, but whereas same with Farfetch'd, it was you had to go and get this pretty early to get usable options, and by then flying normal is kind of already out the door, where psychic typing is just getting started. And I happen to think it's one of the better trades, and plus its move pool is decent. Just saying. I do think it fulfills an interesting niche, and this also comes back to the the fast psychic type attacker, which, as I said earlier, is kind of why Starmie is kind of lower, or Staryu in this case. It's already covered by so many things, and I think Mr. Mime just is early enough to kind of use it. Scyther, bug typing, which doesn't get access to, and flying type, which it doesn't get good access. It's here. We'll talk about specific. Okay, it's kind of good. It's just a slash machine. It's kind of with Sandshrew in that regard. So there you go. You can get this into the casino. Sandshrews earlier. I was thinking real hard on that one. Jinx, another trade thing, but Ice Psychic is very interesting. One, Psychic is busted. We've already known this. But Ice typing, being a good Ice stab user, is actually relatively rare. Yes, we've already talked about this, but when it comes down to like really good special attackers that use the Ice typing with stab, you legit just have Cloyster right now. Yes, Dugong is technically here, but I'm not using a Dugong. And so overall, it's interesting because of the trade, but it's the bottom in this regard. Which goes in Electabuzz. This is a pure electric exclusive, cool, which kind of sucks. But as I talked about earlier, it kind of appears at the same time as these, but it's not walled. So we're going to put it there. Which goes into Magmar, which is actually one of the few interesting fire types. And this happens to be because it can get around a lot of its problems. It's not going to get walled too hard. It has access to Psychic, or in this case, a few other options that you can go through. Seismic Toss, so on and so forth. But when it comes down to it, it is actually a very interesting fire type. It's not going to break any records. I do happen to think it's probably better here. But it's the second best fire type in the game. It just happens to appear really late. But it gets Fire Blast almost immediately, so cool. Pinsir is much more interesting than Scyther by a long shot, and it just happens to be here. It's a bug without stab, which sucks, but it's so strong, so defensive, like physically defensive, that you have to be impressed with it. It's interesting for that regard. Plus, if you're not using a bug, but you just want something that can hit physically hard, it's a very interesting choice, which is why it's going to be here, and probably right there. Next, we're at Tauros. I talked about the normal type problem already, but Tauros kind of changes it. Yes, it does appear in Safari Zone, which is really late, and I've already talked about the issues with that, but it hits incredibly hard, and I happen to think that it does better than Meowth in a lot of cases, but it just appears too late, which is why it's going to go above Krabby, and I can sit behind Magnemite. But yeah. And then we have Magikarp. Magikarp in general is just a really good water type, but then again, there's the key word, water type. Well, water in this case. Words is water type. But it's immune to Earthquake, which is cool. It's quad weak to Electric, which is interesting. But water types are so prominent, but it is early enough. And it does fulfill a weird niche, being that is actually a relevant physical attack. Mixed attacker, sorry, in this game. So I am going to put it probably like right here. I think it's interesting. You could get really early, grind it up, and have a powerhouse. It's broken, but yeah. Lapras. It appears really late in the game, but if you do everything to kind of access Silphco, it kind of just fulfills a really weird spot of being this tank with decent damage output that I think doesn't get copied enough in Generation 1 to really be like taken over that much. When it comes down to it, it also doesn't need a lot of steps outside of just getting to Silphco early to really kind of need it. Because just to give an idea here, when you go to Silphco, all you need to do is bypass the tower, right? The Pokemon Tower, which technically, yes, you could use the Pokédoll, but that's just the casino. Then you go do the tower, and then you're in Silphco. You go immediately and do the 2 fights that you need to get access to Lapras, and then you have access to the rest of the tower. And that you could use level up, and it's not as problematic as the Safari Zone, which, yes, you could technically just go and cycle your way, but you still need access to the tower, and then you have to go explore. Overall, basically, it's a little bit easier than the Safari Mons, which are almost almost all in interesting. They're just limited by their timing. And Lapras happens to be a water type and ice type user that, one, its level up move pool, just you're done. You don't need to technically add anything. Even if you were to not use Surf, it has access to actual moves. And at the same time, it learns Ice Beam, it learns Body Slam. It's just a good Pokemon, which is why it's actually up here. And I'm talking myself into putting it way higher. But because it's a water type and I see the problems here, I'm actually going to split the ground, rock, rock, ground Pokemon here. But yeah, I think Lapras is very interesting. Ditto is just, it's just not usable, dude. I don't, as somebody who went through solo with just Ditto, it's not usable. Just don't do it. Eevee. I am gonna put all the evolutions here, but we're gonna talk about Eevee in general. Is just a super special Pokemon. It kind of can fulfill so many different roles, which goes into. Actually, I'm not gonna put these because I didn't put the other ones. So yeah, I'm just gonna do that. When it comes to the evolutions, though, as we talk about them, you have Vaporeon, which is covered by plenty of other water types, which you can see just looking at this list still left. Jolteon, which is covered by some of the electric types, which Electabuzz is up here. But what makes Jolteon special is, one, it appears before Electabuzz, and it's also not just inherently stuck to a version exclusive. It can also appear at a time where it actually starts getting off the ground. You are limited by the TM compatibility, but hey, you could still use Thunder if you want. It does get access to Double Kick and Pin Missile, which is relatively interesting. And overall, because it's fast, which we talked about with Voltorb, it does crit quite often. Overall, Jolteon is very good. It's probably the best electric type after Pikachu, which would put this in interesting if we were to talk about it, but here's where the difference lies. Flareon. So because you look at the fire type offerings, they aren't very good, right? But Flareon's very special because it has a good special. There's nothing to escape that. It hits incredibly hard on both sides, and it's a great mixed attacker. This is why it's actually up here. It's not because Vaporeon. Yes, Vaporeon and Jolteon are incredibly good, but Vaporeon's probably replaceable to bottom of interesting, and Jolteon is under Pikachu in interesting, and I'd probably put it like below Weedle or above Weedle, or actually above Abra in this case. But Flareon is a fire type that doesn't, it fills the same niche as Charmander, right? It's a mixed attacker. It can do well on both sides. It's not as fast, but it hits a lot harder when it can. And this is also another thing. Eevee can do all three. It can just do all three. So if you're like, okay, I don't have a good water type plan for this run, then pick up a Vaporeon. Oh, I don't have a good electric type. I skipped out on Pikachu. Jolteon. I don't like any of the fire types. Try Flareon. Overall, this is why it's here. Because it's just a Swiss Army knife of not actually like the moves in this case, but typing. So it can fulfill a lot of different roles. Which goes into Porygon. This is more usable than Ditto, but barely. And we've already talked about plenty of normal types at this point. I happen to think it's special in the way it gets like Tri-Attack and the special moves, but it's slow, it's not fun. It's an interesting mon, almost. I'm actually going to put in replaceable because while it is mid, it's special in that it's this massive reward of Casino. So there you go. Omnanite. Water Rock. Water type. Ooh, but rock type. So it's kind of interesting. We'll talk about the fossils both at the same time because they inherently just do the same thing. They're a defensive water type, except on the physical side. You're also quite weak to grass, which is not really that problematic past Erica, and you're especially going to be past Erica, hopefully, when you do it, unless you're going massively out of order. But they fulfill different roles. One's a physical attacker, one's a special attacker. They're both relatively slow for what they are, and they both don't learn rock moves. So while they're interesting for being the fossil, that's basically it. It takes too long. Aerodactyl is super mid. This is funny because as a rock type, it's covered by so many different rock types that it's just not even funny. And as a flying type, there are so many flying types that do better. It doesn't get a move pool. It's just mid. Yes, it does fulfill the certain niche of fast attacker, fast physical attacker specifically, which is covered minimally, but it's one of those things where it's just not good. It's really not that good. We have Snorlax, which actually comes at a point before all the normal types I've already talked about, and it is very, very tanky. It just happens to be slow, and I've already talked about normal types that get kind of their use. It happens to be right above Jigglypuff, in my opinion. Jigglypuff into Wigglytuff is just like the health sponge. This is the later version that does a little better on damage. That's basically how I view it. When it comes to team building, we of course have the legendary birds, which we are going to add, and we're just going to quickly add those because I've almost had an hour, I think. So we have, of course, the ice type. We have the electric type, which is actually very relevant, and then we have Moltres, which one comes in Victory Road. So I'm sorry, like you can't build a team like unless you're picking up right. And what are you using it for? It's just bad. It's just a bad option. But we have Articuno, which is actually really, really cool because one of the more interesting aspects, it's an ice type that can fly, which I get it. A lot of people are like, wait, that it's not, fly isn't that good. But if you look at your flying options, it's actually not that bad of an option. Also comes incredibly late, but it comes at a decent level, so it means you don't have to grind as much. Above all, I'm straight up putting it right below this, and this is probably the second best electric type. You could argue Jolteon, but I do think Zapdos is actually very, very interesting. It's a little out of your way, but you can't get access to this just by beating Koga, which kind of is different from versus having to beat at least the 5 gyms to get access to strength for this. So overall, I kind of do agree with this. It's a little iffy, I'm not gonna lie, but hey, ignoring that, it's fine. Next, we have Dratini, and it's actually the last Pokemon we're talking about here. But when it comes to Dratini, you can catch it, and I'm gonna be brutally honest, it's interesting. I understand a lot of people would be like, no, level 55 is too insane, and yes, you're not going to get fully evolved most of the time for this, but it has access to a plentiful of moves. It's kind of the Swiss Army knife, and it's dragon typing. Funnily enough, I happen to think that Dragonair is actually more relevant to like a good team than Dragonite. It's very interesting in that regard. You can kind of treat it as like a trade evolution that never got off the ground here. But I happen to think it's very interesting, and plus you can catch it, or in this case, buy it from the casino quite early, and it resists a lot. It actually fulfills this interesting kind of pseudo tank, pseudo attacker that isn't really copied by a lot of Pokemon, and in fact, it's kind of super special because it being the super unique typing it is. And while, yeah, maybe you get to Dragonite, it doesn't really care that it becomes Dragonite. It's just resisting and resisting and resisting and attacking super effectively with whatever TMs you have access to. It has access to Surf, of course, and while it is reliant on that, which is why it's down here at the bottom of Super Special, it does have access to all of that. So, it's usable in an insane degree, but I think that is every pre-evolution. I'm going to do a quick check real quick. Technically, Mewtwo is not usable in team building, and Mew is even less so. But technically, it's like this. But when it comes down to it, I think that is every single Pokemon. This is Pokemon based on team building, which I already went over kind of, but it's going to be a little different than a in-game tier list, but you'll see why some of the Pokemon in-game tier lists are a lot higher than each other. I'm straight up going to move this around. I think Eevee does a little better in that regard. But yeah, that's the list. Overall, I'm kind of surprised we have 7 Pokemon. None of them being water types, so it was pretty hard on water types. But you could go and find a water type and interesting, and if it fills a certain niche, and it does well. Honestly, a lot better than I thought Gen 1 was going to be. But you can see the replaceable ones. That's not to say you can't use these. There's just other options that may be better earlier or just do something different. Squirtle's kind of low, but that was long ago. But yeah, that's it. That's an hour of me talking about team building for every single Pokemon in Generation 1 that you have access to by technicality. Mew, you don't. But yeah, overall, I think this is how they're really special in team building. And I think I'll be doing one for every generation as I go. And maybe I'll do a tier list uh, about team building in general. But that'll be a little bit down the line. I'll see you later.